You know, the 60s were a swell time. We got bell bottoms and lava lamps, we went to space, and best of all, we got the Beatles. But there was another very important thing that happened in the 60s, and that was the airing of our favorite prehistoric animated family, the Flintstones. Starting in 1960, the Flintstones is one of the most iconic shows of all time, animated or not. And that's for good reason too. Before Fred Flintstone graced us all with his shenanigans, cartoon shows used to be strictly for kids, and would air on Saturday mornings. Not only did the Flintstones air during prime time, but they also wrote the show like a sitcom, which was unheard of at the time. It was a big gamble, but it paid off big time. And animation was never the same. There's a reason I'm saying all this. Without the Flintstones, there's no Family Guy, Simpsons, or South Park. In fact, every animated show is in debt to the Flintstones for making the general public take them seriously. So we're hopping in our time machine today and going back to look at some of the highlights from the show and pay homage to what is one of the most important shows in human history. So what are we waiting for? Let's Yabba Dabba Doo this! The show opens with a Flintstone flyer, and Fred Flintstone just wants a quiet Sunday to kick back, read the newspaper, and chill out. But his neighbor and best friend Barney Rubble has other plans. Barney decides it's the perfect day to work on his golf swing, and he really gets under Fred's skin. So he moves on to his next hobby, building a helicopter. Okay?
I build things, and it keeps my nimble little fingers busy.
The guy somehow manages to put together a Stone Age copter right next door. Talk about innovation. Naturally, Fred isn't buying it for a second. He's convinced this thing's gonna crash. But wouldn't you know it, Barney actually pulls it off. Now, Fred being Fred can't just accept that he was wrong and leave it at that. Nah, he's gotta try it himself. Cue Fred soaring straight off a cliff. Let's just say gravity doesn't care that you're the star of the show.
There's no bugs in it. You're just too fat.
Still, despite being all banged up, Fred's got his priorities. He's determined to hit up the bowling championship that night, like any true bowler would. Except there's a problem. Wilma reminds him that they've got opera tickets with the Rubbles. And Fred's not really an opera guy. He's got bowling on his mind, not Beethoven. So he hatches a plan with Barney. When it's time to head to the opera, Fred suddenly falls into a state of shock, all dramatic, blaming it on his helicopter crash. That's an Oscar-worthy performance, seriously. Barney then volunteers to stay back and look after Fred, which of course is code for, we're gonna ditch our wives and sneak off to the bowling alley.
Bloody but unbound. You bowl tonight, my captain.
So as soon as Wilma and Betty are out the door, Fred and Barney hop into the newly reinforced helicopter. Barney's beefed it up to handle the extra weight, aka Fred and his bowling balls, but mostly Fred.
I added king-size flippers so it could carry a heavy load, even a fat one.
Fred flaps his arms while Barney pedals, and they make it into town. While Fred and Barney are having the time of their lives bowling, Wilma and Betty are actually enjoying the opera. Everything's going great until the intermission. That's when Betty decides to call home and check on Fred. They use a phone located at the bowling alley, which is right across the street from the theater. Wilma calls home, but shocker, nobody picks up. Betty then spots two guys who look suspiciously like their husbands, but Fred and Barney trick them using fake mustaches and terrible German accents.
You were our husband. Yeah, the both of them.
Is that the way you always greet your husband?
Not exactly master spies, those two. Wilma and Betty decide to head home, but they're seriously suspicious. Meanwhile, Fred and Barney race back to the Flintstone residence, barely making it in time. They quickly set up the sick Fred charade just as their wives walk in. Fred's all smug, thinking that they pulled it off, but then Barney turns around to reveal that he forgot to take off his fake mustache. And that is when it hits the fan.
It was them.
You dope.
Wilma and Betty are not amused. What follows is a classic off-screen beatdown, complete with random objects being thrown out the window because animation was really hard back then. Fred and Barney, they do the only sensible thing. They make a break for it. The episode ends with Wilma and Betty calmly playing a card game, waiting for their husbands. Meanwhile, Fred and Barney are still stuck in the air, their escape plan not looking so hot anymore. Barney's about ready to pass out from all the pedaling, and they're gonna crash. Again, that's what you get for lying to your wives. Jumping around a little bit, the Prowler kicks off with Wilma telling Fred she wants to take judo lessons with Betty. Their town is being terrorized by a burglar, and they're trying to learn how to protect themselves. Now, Fred's not exactly thrilled about the idea. Why? Because in Fred's prehistoric mind, the whole judo thing means Wilma's gonna have to protect him from burglars. And Fred's way too macho to get on board with that.
You are not taking judo lessons. That is final.
Despite Fred's objections, the wives take the lesson and start learning anyway. Anyway, on the flip side, Barney's all for it. He's super chill about Betty learning judo, even when Fred throws a mini tantrum and tries to get him to put his foot down. But Barney's got no problem with it. When Fred gets home, Wilma judo throws him through the wall of their house. This is the last straw for Fred, so he comes up with a plan to prove that judo lessons are a total waste of time. Fred bets Barney that Betty will still scream for help and hide under her bed the moment she faces a burglar. If Betty freaks out, she has to quit the judo lessons. But if Betty fights him off with her new moves, Fred's gonna foot the bill for more.
If she doesn't scream for help and jump under the bed, I'll pay for the judo lessons.
Confident that Betty's judo is no match for his master disguise, which is just a mask, Fred sets his plan into motion. Man, this is gonna end great. Well, here's where things get extra tricky. Turns out there's a real prowler hanging around the neighborhood that same night. Anyway, Barney agrees to help Fred break into his own house to scare his wife, as all good best friends do. Fred sneaks in, ready to scare the daylights out of Betty. What happens next? Betty screams and calls out for Barney. So maybe Fred's about to win the bet. But then, boom. Betty flips into action. She throws Fred around with her judo moves like he's a sack of potatoes. Fred, not expecting to get manhandled like that, runs back home in terror. Looks like judo is the real deal. But guess who's waiting for him at home? The real prowler. This guy takes one look at Fred and literally chucks him out and knocks him around again when he tries to get back in. He goes to Barney's house to call the police, but forgot to take off his mask and she beats the living daylights out of him again.
She needs the police?
Barney confesses to Betty that Fred was the fake prowler. Betty, being the ultimate BFF, immediately calls Wilma to let her in on the prank. And Wilma, who's now armed with some judo tips from Betty, isn't about to let Fred off easy. She gives him an absolute whooping. Later on, the actual prowler sneaks into the Flintstone house, but Wilma thinks it's Fred pulling his prank. She goes all Ronda Rousey on him and ends up throwing the real prowler through the wall like he's the Kool-Aid Man. Oh yeah!
Now ain't that a kick in the head?
That's a badass woman. But here's where it gets even better. After tossing him, Wilma looks over and sees both Fred and the prowler. Realizing she just judo chucked a complete stranger, she freaks out and does the most natural thing, hides under the bed. Barney and Betty show up. But when the prowler shows up again, they all join Wilma under the bed. Fred not only loses the bet and his dignity, but ends up signing up for the judo classes as well. And guess who else is there too? The prowler.
Yeah, Prowler's gotta learn to protect himself if he's gonna stay in business.
Everyone could do with a little self-defense, even burglars. The hot piano opens with Wilma doing everything she can to remind Fred that it's their 10th wedding anniversary tomorrow, including showing up in her wedding dress. Fred, being the blockhead that he is, doesn't seem to take the hint. Turns out, he actually does remember the anniversary, and he's just playing dumb. This year, he's decided to really go big for his wedding anniversary. Forget the flowers. Fred is aiming higher. He's got his sights set on Stoneway piano for Wilma, because nothing says I love you like a giant, unnecessarily expensive musical instrument. After Barney and the shopkeeper both play an unnecessarily long melody, Fred realizes there's a problem. He's got $50 saved up, and the piano actually costs 30 times that.
1,500? He's only got 50.
Just when all hope seems to have run out, Fred meets a guy so shady he's practically a shadow. Enter 88 Fingers Louie. Now, you know things are about to go south when a guy with fingers in his name pops up. This smooth-talking piano salesman just so happens to be hanging out on a random street corner. He offers Fred a fantastic deal, a Stoneway piano for exactly $50. You'd think the massive discount would raise a red flag, but Fred, he's too excited to question it.
How'd you like to pick up a pretty hot piano?
Sure.
Louie's explanation is that he's got no store and no overhead, so he can sell it for cheap, which somehow makes sense to Fred. But Fred can't exactly carry a piano by himself, so he ropes in good old Barney to help him lug it home. Instead of paying for delivery, they stash the piano in Fred's garage and wait until midnight to sneak it into the house. The plan? Move the piano quietly into the house without waking Wilma. The reality? Not so much. After a failed attempt to hoist the piano in through the window, Fred decides to take it in through the front door. Unfortunately, he pushes the piano way too hard, and this thing rockets through the house like it's got a mind of its own. It busts through walls, shoots out the other side, and suddenly, Fred's in a full-on chase trying to stop this rogue piano from wreaking havoc on Bedrock. Fred, who really wants to stop the piano, hops onto it in an attempt to stop it, but just ends up riding it down the street like some caveman cowboy. And of course, this is when a snarky Bedrock cop decides to show up. He pulls Fred over for recklessly driving a piano.
Imagine driving a hot piano through a red light.
But I wasn't.
That's a pretty specific crime. Fred gets hauled off to the police station, where things only go from bad to worse. The duty sergeant takes one look at him and decides he's 88 Fingers Louie, the guy behind a string of stolen pianos. Fred, panicking, tries to explain he's just a well-meaning husband trying to score brownie points with his wife. The sergeant, who turns out to be a big softy, sympathizes and orders his officers to help Fred with his romantic piano surprise.
Give this criminal a hand with his anniversary gift, while I run out and get one for my own little...
So they head back to the Flintstone house, where Fred's about to make his big anniversary move. Wilma wakes up to find a piano in her living room, Barney playing it, and the cops serenading her with a heartfelt rendition of Happy Anniversary. Pretty romantic, right? Well, there's a catch. The authorities aren't done with Fred. Turns out the piano is hot, as in stolen, so the officers are ready to drag Fred back to jail.
So long, Barney. So long, 88 Fingers, Louie, Fred.
Just as Fred's ready to kiss his freedom and his anniversary goodbye, a last-minute radio call comes in. The real 88 Fingers Louie has been caught.
88 Fingers Louie has just been apprehended.
See, I told you.
Fred's off the hook, but the piano, not so much. The cops confiscate it, leaving Fred with no choice but to go back to Plan A, flowers. The long weekend opens when Fred gets an invitation from his old pal Gus Gravel to spend a relaxing weekend at the Seaside Gravel Hotel. What Gus Smoo Gravel conveniently leaves out is that he's broke and has lost his staff after gambling away their payroll.
Boy, if only I hadn't bet the payroll on that fifth race.
With a 200-person Water Buffalo convention coming up the same weekend, Gus sees Fred's visit as the perfect solution to his staffing crisis. Fred and Barney dive right into vacation mode. Literally, ending up face first in beach mud, getting their boat thrown onto a hotel room by the Loch Ness Monster's great-granddad, and even getting into a breathing war with a pesky bird while snorkeling. Just as they start to settle in, Gus reveals his no-staff problem. Fred and Barney offer to help, thinking Gus will politely decline. Instead, Gus jumps at the offer and ropes Fred in as the chef, Barney as the bellhop, and Wilma and Betty as maids. Then, the Water Buffalo convention arrives, and chaos erupts. Fed up with the work and the demands of the Grand Poobah, Fred and the gang try to leave.
What's the idea?
The idea is we're getting out of here.
But Slagheap, the Poobah, gets chased off by the angry wives of the Buffaloes, who want no part in taking over hotel duties. Wilma takes charge, snags the Poobah hat, and demands a proper vacation at a real hotel. And this time, Fred and Barney know better than to argue.
And we obey, Your Highness. Yep, if we know what's good for us.
The episode Alvin Brickrock Presents opens with Fred and Barney getting a new neighbor. And naturally, these two can't resist getting all nosy about it. Their latest hobby? Spying on the mysterious guy living in the big old gloomy house behind theirs. And they watch it like it's some sort of boxing match.
Who's fighting?
The new neighbors, Mrs. and Mr. Brickrock.
This guy, Alvin Brickrock, is a bit odd. He's got a monocle, a bandage on his forehead, and always says, "Good evening," with the most exaggerated English accent you've ever heard.
Good evening, Mr. Flintstone.
Oh, and his wife, Agatha, she used to be heard yelling all the time, but now she's just gone. Little mysterious. Just then, Alvin shows up at the Flintstones' door asking to borrow a shovel. No big deal, right? Except Alvin starts talking about how he's been transferred to a new territory and that his wife Agatha has already gone ahead. His phrasing is super weird. Like when he says things like, "she fights moving and she goes all to pieces," which makes Fred super suspicious. Throw in the fact that Alvin says he has to do all the packing, and it'll take a week to clean up everything.
I have to do all her packing myself. It'll take me a week to clean up everything.
And Fred's conspiracy theory radar is going off the charts. Fred's been reading way too much of his weird detective magazine lately, and suddenly it clicks. Alvin isn't just Alvin Brickrock, no. Fred's convinced this guy is actually Albert Boneheart, a criminal who's allegedly gotten rid of 3 wives and has an English-accented obsession with saying good evening. Brickrock's creepy comments, his request for a spade, and his missing wife all add up in Fred's mind. Naturally, he drags Barney into it, and together, they come to the brilliant conclusion that Alvin has, without a doubt, killed Agatha and is about to bury her in the backyard.
Shovel, and the rope, and the axe. Fred, you mean he?
But of course, Fred and Barney don't just stop there. They go full-on detective mode and decide to investigate Alvin, which involves sneaking into his house and sneaking around like a couple of prehistoric Sherlocks. While poking around, they stumble upon a mastodon skeleton, which is just casually hanging out in their house, and a bunch of other weird archaeologist-type stuff. That's when Barney opens what looks like a coffin and says that he found Agatha.
It's not a phone booth. We found Agatha.
Fred tells him to stay put while he goes to get a cop to bring this criminal in. But that's when Brickrock catches Fred and Barney in his study. But instead of flipping out like any normal person would, Alvin calmly explains that he's just an archaeologist. He's been in Bedrock to dig up rare scientific treasures, hence the spade. He even shows off his bizarre collection, which includes a mummy and a piranha, a flying man-eating fish. That, low-key, sounds so terrifying. But Fred and Barney are too busy thinking about Agatha to care. Then they spot a trunk with the initials AB and immediately jump to the worst conclusion. Agatha's body must be in the trunk.
Mrs. Brickrock!
Did you hear a knock? Yeah.
But Barney doesn't think a person could fit into a trunk like that. So Fred gets his own trunk that is the exact same kind and fits in to prove his theory. He ends up getting stuck inside, and Wilma has to break him out. They then explain the whole theory to her, and she just laughs it off. That's when Brickrock shows up again, still oblivious to their wild assumptions, confirms that, yes, the trunk does belong to Agatha, and then he opens it. What do they find? Agatha's bodybuilding equipment. Yep. The trunk is stuffed with weights, barbells, and all the other gear she needs for her daily workout routines. As Fred and Barney are busy trying to process that they've just spent an entire day chasing after absolutely nothing, Brickrock casually calls his pussycat Agatha on the phone. Turns out she's alive. Well, and presumably lifting heavy things in her new town. Cue the massive sigh of relief from Fred and Barney.
Mrs. Brickrock sounds alive and kicking.
She sure does.
But wait, just when you think it's all over, Alvin Brickrock gives us one last eyebrow-raising moment. He turns to the camera and delivers a creepy monologue, casually dropping the fact that his man-eating fish, that delightful little piranha, is more than capable of devouring a wife, if he trained it to.
Man-eater, which can be trained to eat wives.
Well, that's not disturbing at all. The Little White Lie starts on the weekend, and Fred wants nothing more than to chill at home, read the newspaper, maybe take a nice long shower, and hit the sack early. When Wilma suggests they hit up the movies for a nice evening out, Fred says he's too tired, and just can't do anything but rest. Wilma buys it, and Fred's feeling pretty good about his low-effort night in. But then Barney strolls in with some very important news. A big poker game is going down at Sam Quartz's house, and the best part? Fred's favorite poker victim, Stanley Stonebrews, is gonna be there. Fred's eyes light up, because Stonebrews, that guy always loses. And Fred knows he can rake in a pile of cash without breaking a sweat. But how's Fred gonna ditch Wilma without getting caught? Simple, of course. He's gonna lie. Fred spins a yarn about how Stanley's super sick and needs Fred to hold his hand. Real smooth, Fred.
Tired as I am, I gotta drag my weary bones out of the house and stay with Stanley.
Off to the poker game he goes, and wait you know it, Fred cleans up, winning a whopping 200 clams. But here's the thing, Fred's little lie is about to bite him in the prehistoric butt. He realizes if he comes home with all that cash, Wilma's gonna figure out that Stanley wasn't sick, and Fred's little poker escapade will be exposed. So Fred does what Fred does best. He spins another lie. He tells Wilma he found the money in the street, inside an abandoned wallet. Problem solved, right? Wrong, because Wilma, being a decent person, insists they tell the newspaper about it so they can find the rightful owner. Now Fred is stuck in his web of lies, and it's getting messier by the minute.
I don't blame you for being worried, Fred. Anybody can claim that money.
Fred decides to claim the money and ropes Barney into the scheme, convincing him to pose as Tilly Schimmelstone, a poor old widow who's lost her life savings and is too sick to come and collect the money herself. Barney's gotta call Wilma and pretend to be this tragic figure, and bless Barney, he actually goes along with it. In his best old lady voice, Barney convinces Wilma to send the wallet to general delivery at the Bedrock post office. But when he finds out Wilma already mailed the wallet to the post office, he decides to go get it back by disguising himself as Tilly's mustached nephew and wheels Barney, who's obviously dressed as Tilly, into the post office to collect the $200. Everything's going according to plan until Daisy Kilgranite, a reporter from the local newspaper, shows up with her crew of photographers.
And we want to get some pictures of your poor aunt recovering her money.
Pictures? Pictures?
They want to do a news story about the poor widow's struggle. Now Fred and Barney are in a full panic. They try to escape the cameras, but Barney's wig flies off mid-escape. We can all see where this is going. As if things couldn't get any worse, guess who's standing at the post office entrance? Yep, Wilma. And Betty, who are there with the very reporter who's trying to turn Fred and Barney into front-page news. Busted. Now it's time for Fred and Barney to make their escape. Fred pushes Barney in the wheelchair through Bedrock streets, while Wilma and Betty are hot on their heels in a taxi. They tear through town, only to hit a literal dead end, smack into a brick wall. Now Fred's trapped, and Wilma's demanding answers. Does Fred fess up? Well, of course not. He tries one last desperate lie, saying the money actually belongs to Barney.
I'll tell the truth. It's Barney's.
But Barney, being Barney, sees an opportunity and goes with it. He spends the money on a fancy dinner, treating Betty and the Flintstones to a night out on the town, while Fred just sits there completely frustrated that his poker winnings ended up wasted on a fancy dinner and 12 bottles of champagne. Again, that's what you get for lying to your wife. The X-Ray Story kicks off with Dino, the Flintstones' prehistoric pet, acting all weird. He hasn't touched his food in 2 days, and he's been snoozing around the clock. Naturally, Wilma's worried about her beloved Dino doggo, so she calls Fred at the quarry to tell him Dino needs to see a vet. Fred, not exactly thrilled about the idea, still takes Dino to the vet, who has a German accent for some reason.
Oh, that's no good.
And he's sleeping all the time.
Well, the poor animal might be
The
tired.
vet checks Dino out, does some x-rays, and finds a dinopeptic germ hanging out in Dino's stomach. Fred immediately panics because, let's face it, if it sounds remotely medical, Fred's freaking out. But the vet assures him that it's no big deal. Dino just needs a few days of rest, and he'll be back to bouncing around like usual. As Fred and Dino exit the office, the vet secretary writes Fred's name and address on Dino's x-ray. But a gust of wind sends it flying out the window. And where does it land? Right in the hands of a passing policeman. The cop, thinking that it's Fred's x-ray, passes it along to a doctor at the Bedrock PD's forensic lab, and Dr. Sandstone jumps to the wildest conclusion possible: Fred Flintstone has a dinopeptic germ. And in humans, this germ is really dangerous. If Fred falls asleep, the germ will kill him. The only cure, Fred has to stay awake and active for 72 hours straight. And here's the kicker: no one can tell Fred because the shock might actually finish him off. Dr. Sandstone rushes over to the Flintstone residence to break the news to Wilma, and now she's in full panic mode.
You must keep him awake.
Oh, thank you, Doctor. Oh, my goodness.
Fred's out there living his normal life, completely clueless, while Wilma and the rebels are plotting how to keep him awake for 3 straight days without letting him know why. Challenge accepted, I guess. Fred comes home exhausted from a long day at work, but before he can even think about resting, Wilma, Barney, and Betty spring into action. They drag him out for a night on the town, taking him to every rock-themed club in Bedrock. The Rockadero, the Rockin' 20s, the Rockin' Bop. Poor Fred can't figure out why they're all suddenly so obsessed with going out dancing.
What's with you guys? Have you all flipped? I gotta go to work tomorrow.
Meanwhile, he's guzzling gallons of black coffee just to keep his eyes open. When the nightclubs don't do the trick, Wilma takes it up a notch. They take Fred ice skating until the crack of dawn, and Fred absolutely sucks at it, slamming into every wall. And if that wasn't enough, they proceed to walk him all the way home. But Fred is dying to fall asleep, so they take some desperate measures: cold showers, toothpicks in his eyelids, and blowing New Year's Eve horns right in his ear. The guy is beyond exhausted, but Wilma and the gang are in overdrive, doing anything and everything to keep Fred's eyes open. Finally, Wilma decides there's no choice but to let Fred in on the situation. She spills the beans about his deadly illness and the need to stay awake. Fred naturally freaks out for a hot second, but then something clicks. He starts to piece together the story, and after a few panicked moments, he demands to see the evidence. Once he gets a look at the x-ray, it takes Fred about 2 seconds to recognize that it's not actually his stomach, it's Dino's.
This is Dino's X-ray.
Dino!
Fred realizes the whole thing was a massive misunderstanding. Beyond exhausted at this point, he doesn't even bother lecturing Wilma, Barney, or Betty about their wild scheme. He just crashes right there next to Dino and finally gets some much-needed shut-eye. The episode Dino Goes Hollyrock starts, and Fred's got his heart set on watching a big fight on TV, but there's a little problem. Dino's got his own plans. The lovable Dino dog is completely obsessed with the adventures of Sassy, a melodramatic show starring a female dinosaur, and it's on at the same time as Fred's fight. Dino's not about to give up his sassy time,
And that's my TV set. Yeah, but those are Dino's teeth.
and the battle for the TV remote begins. Naturally, Dino wins because who can say no to a dinosaur who's in love with a TV character? Fred just goes to Barney's to watch the fight. But Dino's love for Sassy goes beyond just watching. He finds out that if he collects 6 proofs of purchase from Dino Grow Pet Food, he can get an autographed picture of Sassy. Now, Dino's on a mission.
Autograph photo of Sassy. All you have to do is send in 10 labels from Dino Grow Pet Food.
He grabs his leash and literally drags Fred to the supermarket. Fred's just trying to survive, being yanked around like he's on the other end of the leash, while Dino loads up shopping cart with 6 cans of Dino Grow. At this point, Fred's furious. He doesn't want to be the guy buying 6 cans of dino food for a picture of a fake TV star. But the cashier is staring him down and Fred gives in, and Dino is over the moon. But then, Fred spots something on the can that changes everything. There's an ad asking for a talented animal to audition for a part on the adventures of Sassy. The role comes with a big payday, and Fred's eyes light up with dollar signs. If Dino lands this gig, Fred could be rolling in the clam.
Oh, Fred, not Dino.
Sure, Dino's a gold mine.
So after some failed training with dreams of fame and fortune in his head, Fred takes Dino to Screen Rock's television productions for the big audition. Now for the role, it's Sassy's love interest, because of course it is. Dino is all in, pulling out his best moves to impress the casting team. He dances like a vaudeville star, puts on a dramatic death scene that would make any actor jealous, and pours his heart into the audition. Dino nails the audition and he does perfect at the screen test the next day. The director is so impressed that Dino's hired for regular appearances on the show. Fred is over the moon, thinking that he hit the jackpot. But there's a catch. A pushy agent swoops in, offering Fred a deal. If Fred agrees to give up responsibility for Dino and go home, he'll get $30 a week, while Dino becomes a full-time TV star. For Fred, that sounds pretty sweet.
Don't worry, you'll get $30 a week. Sign here.
30 a week, eh?
So he takes the money and heads home. Meanwhile, back at the studio, Dino's starting to see the downside of fame. He overhears the agent and director talking about changes they want him to make to his appearance, like trimming his long tail. And to top it off, Dino catches a glimpse of Sassy without her wig and false eyelashes. Spoiler, she's not the glamorous Dino that he thought she was. In fact, she's downright repulsive, and Dino realizes that showbiz isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Reality starts to hit Fred. The house feels empty without Dino, and before long, he's sitting by the fireplace feeling emotional and realizing he's lost his best friend to fame. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Fred's eyes fill with tears as he tosses his first payment into the fire. He even lights a candle and places it by the window, holding a lonely vigil for Dino's return. It's honestly one of the most touching scenes in the Flintstones, and you can't help but feel for Fred as he regrets the decision that he made.
That's right. You'd say, so long, Fred, you money-grubbing cheapskate.
But then, Fred hears a familiar squeak. It's Dino. He snuck out of the studio and made a beeline back home. Fred hugs Dino, realizing that no amount of money could ever replace the love that he has for his pet. Guess it's not dogs, but dinosaurs that are a man's best friend. High School Fred opens with Mr. Slate's company tightening the belt, and the new efficiency expert, Mr. Rockhard, has a plan to cut costs. Any worker without a high school diploma needs to go back to school or face the axe. This spells trouble for Fred, but Slate can't afford to lose his star player on the company bowling team, so he offers Fred a deal: stay on the payroll while attending 2 weeks of high school to get his diploma.
You can have your job back if you go to high school for 2 weeks.
Fred's embarrassed by the whole situation, so when Wilma hears he's going back to school, she misunderstands and thinks he's attending an executive school to move up the ranks at work. Fred plays along, maintaining the charade that he's training for promotion while secretly squeezing his oversized self into a classroom desk and surprising his teenage classmates with his impressive knowledge of Bedrock's geology. What? And of course, he's all in on the high school experience, joining his young pals at the malt shop for milkshake guzzling and brontosaurus burger feasts, and even jumping into school sports. By the time Fred stumbles home each night, he's completely wiped out.
Fred said he wasn't hungry.
Oh, I wish we had a tape recorder.
Wilma's convinced executive school is running him ragged, so she asks Barney to check up on him. Barney's shocked to see Fred in full teen mode at the malt shop, guzzling milkshakes and dancing his belly off to jukebox tunes with his teenage fan club. When Barney confronts Fred, Fred comes clean and begs Barney not to spill the beans to Wilma until after he gets his diploma. But things escalate when Fred's impressive physique gets him recruited onto the high school football team.
Come on, son. Let's talk things over down on the football field.
As luck would have it, Barney accidentally brings Wilma and Betty to the big championship game, and the wives are stunned to see Fred on the field suited up as a key player. After some quick explaining, Wilma and Betty decide to join in on the cheering section for Fred, who ends up scoring the winning touchdown. In the end, Fred earns his diploma and wraps up with a memorable graduation speech. High school is only for the young, because only the young can take it. My aching back.
No, my aching back.
Dial S for Suspicion opens with Fred's latest scheme kicking off when he decides to go big and apply for an executive job at the fancy Stone Valley Inn, a mountain resort where you can ski in the morning and swim in the afternoon. Now the job has some serious prerequisites. You need to speak Spanish and have a college degree. Fred, of course, stretches the truth about both. He's pretty confident his 3 words of Spanish, taco, burrito, and siesta, and his exaggerated claims of higher education will get him through. And guess what? It does. Fred lands an interview with Conrad Hailstone, the hotel's owner, and he's accepted for the managerial position. The only catch? He's got to pass a free physical exam from the company doctor. Feeling like he's hit the jackpot, Fred can't wait to tell Wilma about his future 6-figure salary. This gives Wilma an idea. Why not take out a life insurance policy on Fred? Sorry, I don't know why that made me laugh. It's just good planning, right? If something did happen to Fred, Wilma would be set with a $40,000 payout.
But a wife should have protection in case something happens to her husband.
Fred's too focused on his new executive role to really think twice about it, so he signs the papers. But things take a weird turn when Barney stumbles upon Wilma's book, Dial S for Suspicion. The plot? A wife insures her husband for a fortune, then arranges his untimely demise to cash in on the policy. Naturally, Barney's like, hey Fred, you might want to take a look at this. At first, Fred laughs it off. Wilma? Plotting to take him out? That's ridiculous. But then the hatchet incident happens. What's the hatchet incident, you ask? Wilma's chopping meat one day with a hatchet, but the handle's faulty. The blade flies right across the room, almost cutting his head off. The timing is so perfect that Fred's paranoia starts to creep in. Maybe Barney is onto something. Is Wilma really trying to kill him for the insurance money?
She wanted to get rid of you. She wouldn't throw a cleaver at you. She'd do something safe, like putting bug spray in your soup.
Fred starts connecting dots that aren't really there. He tells Barney he's convinced Wilma threw that hatchet on purpose. Things escalate when, later that night, Fred wakes up to find Wilma standing over him holding a pillow. She's just picking it up off the floor. But Fred, in full panic mode, assumes that she's about to suffocate him. So what does Fred do? Naturally, he screams and bolts straight through the bedroom wall like the Kool-Aid Man. Oh yeah! And then, things get really weird. Rodney Whetstone, an old boyfriend of Wilma's who just happens to be a professional knife thrower, shows up in Bedrock with his circus. He invites the Flintstones and the Rebels to watch his act, and Wilma volunteers Fred to be the guy standing against the target board.
To be my target! Somebody brave and trusting, preferably somebody with paid-up life insurance.
While Rodney throws knives at him. Fred's already on edge. Pretty good. He's already on edge after he survives the first barrage of knives, but it gets worse. Wilma suggests that Rodney perform the act blindfolded. Now Fred's absolutely convinced that this is the end. The second Rodney puts on that blindfold, Fred snaps. He breaks free from the ropes holding him to the board and runs for his life, fully believing that Wilma and Rodney want to turn him into a pincushion. Anyway, desperate to avoid whatever Wilma has planned, Fred hatches a ridiculous plan to fail his life insurance exam.
I'm not gonna pass the examination. That way Wilma can't expect any money.
He uses a fake arm with no pulse and a ticking clock to fake a bad heart. His goal? Convince the doctor that he's unfit for life insurance so Wilma won't have any reason to finish him off. Genius. Well, not so much. Fred finds out that the guy he's trying to fool isn't the life insurance doctor at all, it's the physician from Stone Valley Inn, the one vetting him for his new job.
But Stone Valley Inn,
But doctor...
which naturally you are in no condition to take.
The doctor...
Fred's little stunt just cost him his executive position. When Wilma finally finds out what's been going on, she's not happy. She confronts Fred about his ridiculous suspicions, and she doesn't hold back. She's been nothing but supportive, and Fred's been running around like he's the star of a murder mystery. Fred, thoroughly embarrassed, has to admit that he let his imagination and Barney's wild theories get the best of him. Still, Wilma forgives him, and the two make up. The blessed event opens with Fred hitting the gym. Yeah, you heard that right. The gym. He and Barney decide to pump some iron at Brick Boulder's gymnasium. Why, you ask? Well, because he and Wilma are about to welcome a child into the world. While Fred's busy trying to look like a caveman bodybuilder, he strains something and it looks like his left shoulder, which is relatable for everybody who's ever gone to the gym, ever. So he asks Boulder, the fake bodybuilder and gym owner, for some alcohol liniment to soothe his ancient muscles.
Oh boy, that suit sure is heavy.
Now, cut to Fred meeting up with Wilma at Dr. Rockpile's office. Wilma just had one of her routine baby checkups, and the doc drops the bomb that he needs a blood sample from the soon-to-be dad. Cue Fred's total freakout. The guy is crazy afraid of needles. So what does he do? He hides. Rockpile's nurse, who's clearly not about to put up with Fred's nonsense, thinks she found Fred's butt under the sheet and sticks the needle in. Turns out she actually hid the bottle of liniment in Fred's back pocket. So when Fred walks out, proud of his pain-free blood draw, the doc and nurse are left wondering why Fred's blood smells more like a distillery than a DNA sample.
Funny-looking blood. Better run a test on it, nurse, but I'm sure he's all right.
Back at home, Fred freaks out when he realizes that Wilma will be ready to deliver the baby any day now, and immediately makes sure every little thing is perfect for his wife. He almost has a meltdown one night, but then Betty suggests they should do a trial run so that they're prepared. The real madness kicks in when Wilma announces she's ready. Every bit of rehearsal flies out the window. Barney and Fred tear the place apart, and basically do everything except get Wilma into the car. Fred's so flustered that when he goes to grab Wilma from the bed, he ends up hauling Dino under a bedsheet instead. because your wife and your pet dinosaur are totally interchangeable. So Fred rushes Dino, still under the sheet, into the car and speeds off to the hospital. Enter the confused motorcycle cop who pulls Fred over because, well, he sees a dinosaur wrapped in a sheet and Fred calling it his pregnant wife.
This one's a dog.
Now, just a minute. You can't talk that way about my wife.
Fred finally realizes that he's been chauffeuring Dino and not Wilma, so he slams the brakes and does a U-turn back to the house. Meanwhile, Barney is driving Wilma to the hospital when they run into Fred. After some wrong exchanges of passengers, they all get in Barney's car and head to the hospital. But the revolving door sends Fred into the hotel across the street. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the nurse at the desk confuses Wilma for Barney's wife because, he's standing there with her. After this little mix-up with the nurse, Fred finally goes in to see the baby. Wilma has given birth to a beautiful baby girl, Pebbles Flintstone. Fred's absolutely smitten with his little red-headed daughter, and her first words, Yabba Dabba Doo.
Yabba Dabba Doo.
No DNA test needed. That's his daughter, all right. The episode Anne Margrock Presents opens with Fred working at his construction site when his dinosaur chips a tooth. While the dentist comes over to get it fixed, Fred's boss tells him that the job they're working on is for Anne Margrock, the biggest pop star on the prehistoric scene. Everything is totally fine until Fred's buddy Loudmouth Harry spills the beans. Anne Margrock's show will feature local amateur talent. Well, you already know by now what happens when Fred gets a whiff of fame. He convinces Barney that they have star potential too.
The big mouth Harry Goldbrick can audition, so can we. I don't know, Fred.
The fact that their singing voices could make a painting cry is irrelevant. They're gonna be stars. Meanwhile, Anne Margrock's agent, Mr. Bobby Rockley, can tell that Anne needs a break from all the crazy fans swarming her at the Hillstone Hotel. He suggests that she lay low somewhere quiet for a few days. So she goes off in her car until, of course, the thing gets a flat tire right outside the Flintstones' house. Wait, aren't those tires made of stone? Anyway, Anne knocks on the door. She says she needs to use a phone, and Fred, being the friendly caveman that he is, lets her in. But Fred, Wilma, Barney, and Betty have no idea she's the famous Anne Margrock. She introduces herself as Annie, and the Flintstones welcome her in like she's just some regular visitor. When Pebbles starts crying because Fred and Barney's singing is unbearable, Annie sweetly calms her down with a lullaby. The Flintstones are impressed and hire her as a babysitter, but are still totally clueless about who she really is. Meanwhile, Annie politely nudges Fred and Barney into dropping their disastrous singing act, and instead trying a little soft shoe dancing with a hat and cane. Spoiler alert, they're still pretty bad, but hey, at least they're not making Pebbles cry anymore. Fred and Barney, still believing Annie is just another amateur performer, ask her to join them in their bid to be on the Anne Margrock show. She says yes, but plays it cool, not revealing that she is Anne Margrock.
We want you to appear with us.
You mean you take me on as a partner?
That's right.
Then disaster strikes. At the last minute, Anne's sponsor decides they don't want any local talent, just Margrock herself. Fred and Barney are crushed, apologizing to Annie for not being able to make their big TV debut, but plot twist, Anne dashes onto the stage in full Margrock mode and starts performing. Fred and Barney are floored, finally realizing who their house guest really is. And Anne Margrock, being the cool star that she is, changes the sponsor's mind and brings Fred and Barney on stage to perform with her. So even though they're about as musically talented as two doorknobs, Fred and Barney still get their moment in the spotlight, and Bedrock history is made. Little Bam Bam starts, and Fred has hit peak grumpiness. Turns out he's had enough of the Rubble's daily visits to see Pebbles. To make things worse, Barney's goofy antics like imitating birds, horses, and for some reason upside-down cakes are making Fred super mad. Pebbles, of course, loves every minute of it. But Fred, his stomach's doing backflips, mostly because he can't make Pebbles laugh the way that Barney can. Feeling insecure, Fred snaps and sends the Rubbles packing. Cue Wilma, who's got zero patience for Fred's nonsense. She cooks him for being a rude and terrible friend, and rightly so.
I wouldn't want her to know her father made our best friends feel bad just because we've been blessed with a child and they have not.
After being told off by Wilma, Fred realizes he messed up and goes over to the Rubbles' place to apologize. Meanwhile, Barney and Betty are feeling a little left out of the parenting club. They want a child of their own to spoil with bird imitations and upside-down cake jokes. That night, they spot a falling star and make a wish, hoping for a little bundle of joy to call their own, and that's exactly how children are born. obviously. Wouldn't you know it, the next morning, there's a basket on their doorstep with a giggling toddler inside. The kid's got white hair, a brawny build, and oh yeah, he's carrying a club, and he's already slamming on the floor like a fun-sized Thor. Meet Bam Bam. There's a note saying that he's an orphan who needs a good home, and Barney's convinced it's because of their star wish. Betty's over the moon, and Barney's as happy as someone who's won the lottery. Even after Bam Bam throws him around like a rag doll.
Well, now I know how he got the name of Bam Bam.
But it's never that simple in Bedrock. The Rubbles can't just keep Bam Bam, they have to go through the proper channels and report him to the Child Welfare Authority. Turns out there's already a fancy pants rich guy, Stony Feller, who's filed an application to adopt Bam Bam. So now the Rubbles are going to court because a child custody case over a club-swinging toddler is the next logical step. Barney and Betty aren't backing down. They hire Bronto Burger as their lawyer while Stony Feather brings in the big guns, Perry Masonry, a hotshot attorney who's basically unbeatable.
His lawyer is, it's Perry Masonry. He never loses a case.
Fred and Wilma are right by their side, supporting the Rubbles as they head to Bedrock Municipal Court for the big showdown. The judge, who happens to be Masonry's estranged brother, seems like he might be on their side until Masonry starts working his lawyer magic. He grills poor Barney, asking him to remember where he was on a random, non-eventful day. Of course, Barney can't remember, and in classic Barney fashion, he panics. Under all the pressure, Barney's brain goes into shutdown mode and he starts acting like a complete goof on the witness stand. Not a good look for someone trying to win custody.
Is trying to make him look like a monkey.
And doing a good job. Look.
As expected, the judge grants custody of Bam Bam to Stony Feller. The Rubbles are heartbroken, especially Barney, who takes the loss really hard. But here's where things take a twist. Right after winning the case, Stony Feather finds out his wife is expecting a baby of their own, so he decides to give up custody of Bam Bam and hand him over to the Rubbles. But Barney doesn't know this yet. Completely devastated, he walks out of the courthouse feeling like his life is over without little Bam Bam. In full dramatic fashion, he decides he's going to throw himself off a bridge, rock tied to his leg and all. Classic Barney, always going from 0 to 100. Just in the nick of time, Fred, Wilma, and Betty show up at the bridge with Bam Bam in tow. When Barney sees his beloved little club-swinging toddler safe and sound in Betty's arms, he instantly abandons his bridge-jumping plans. His life isn't over. Far from it. In fact, it's just beginning, as Bam Bam's proud dad.
Hello to Uncle Fred, Bam Bam. He may look all wet, but he's really a nice guy.
Just like that, the Rubbles are officially a family. 10 Little Flintstones starts with Fred just doing his usual caveman chores, putting Pebbles to bed, taking out the trash, minding his own business, when little does he know, he's got the attention of someone or something. Turns out there's a little green man with pointy ears and a creepy whirring voice, floating above in a flying saucer, scoping out Earth. Apparently, this alien scout's got plans for an invasion of Earth.
Image of an Earthman for the purpose of taking over the Earth.
Why aliens want to invade a world where people use pelicans as garbage disposals is anybody's guess. But hey, aliens are kinda weird. Step 1 of this intergalactic plan? Infiltration. And who better to copy than Fred Flintstone himself? The alien takes one look at Fred, decides he's the perfect prototype for blending in with Stone Age society, and behind Fred's back starts cloning him. Not just once, but 10 times. Suddenly, there are 10 Freds roaming around Bedrock. These clones may look like Fred, but they're stronger, have a one-track mind, and can only say one thing, Yabba Dabba Doo.
Yabba Dabba Doo!
Excellent.
What else would you expect from a Flintstone knockoff? The clones get to work, causing all sorts of mayhem, like throwing laundry on Wilma and sneaking into the Rubbles' house in the middle of the night, raiding their fridge, and clobbering Barney with a sandwich when he tells Fred to knock it off. The clones continue to make a lot of fuss, including getting Fred fired by physically assaulting his boss. But it's not all chaos. One of the Fred clones ends up helping Mr. Slade out in a round of golf, showing off some skills that impress Slade's potential client, Mr. Rockwell. Little does he know, it's not Fred, it's alien clone Fred, a literal powerhouse with limited vocabulary.
Let's play again soon, Flintstone.
Yabba Dabba Doo!
Still, Slade's over the moon, thinking Fred's made him look like a genius in front of his client. Meanwhile, Fred starts to notice that something is off. He's getting credit for things he didn't do and blamed for things he doesn't remember doing. The ransacked fridge, the random feats of strength. Fred knows something weird is going on. But when he sees all of his clones, he doesn't think those are alien doppelgangers. That's too wild, even for Fred. Instead, he thinks his water buffalo buddies are pulling a prank on him. Then the moment of truth. Fred finally spots his clones out in the open and gives chase. He follows them right into their headquarters, which turns out to be the flying saucer. It's here that the alien scout finally reveals his big plan. Well, his failed big plan. Apparently, these formidable Earthlings have figured him out, so he's calling it quits on the whole world domination thing. The alien kicks Fred out of the saucer before blasting off into space.
Holy mackerel, that's a real flying saucer!
Fred realizes that he just single-handedly stopped an alien invasion and heads home to tell Wilma and the Rubbles all about his heroic encounter with little green men and his army of Fred clones. Surprise, surprise, they don't believe him at all. They're just rolling their eyes, thinking he's lost it. Fred is pissed. But when Wilma says she's cooking him a big dinner, he forgets all about it. Operation Switchover begins with Fred being pushed around by Wilma because she's participating in a competition to be the best housewife. The committee comes over and absolutely loves Wilma. But when they leave, that's when the drama starts. Turns out, Fred thinks Wilma's housework is a breeze compared to his job at the quarry.
When a man gets married, he's supposed to do the work. The little woman stays home and takes it easy.
Wilma disagrees, so they agree to a challenge to swap roles for a day. Wilma heads to the quarry and wreaks havoc with the dinosaur lift, dropping boulders on Mr. Slade and getting sent home. Meanwhile, Fred's home alone trying to keep up with Wilma's chores, pebbles, Dino, laundry, and a rice cooking disaster that floods the house. Wilma calls, pretending that she nailed the job and is off to a movie with Betty. Fred, too proud to admit that he's overwhelmed, says he's handling everything fine. Just then, a rep from Good Cave Keeping magazine calls to say Wilma's won Housewife of the Year and will be stopping by for photos. Fred panics.
She's gonna be here in 20 minutes. 20 minutes? She can't!
Drags Barney and his poker buddies into the cleanup and, out of desperation, dresses up as Wilma to fool the rep. The ruse actually works, and Fred wins a Rock Vegas vacation, but he realizes he's in trouble when the real Wilma sees a photo of her in the magazine. Despite the embarrassment, Wilma's thrilled with the win, and both agree that their own jobs are tougher than they thought. A haunted house is not a home begins with Fred getting some big news. He's about to be rich, or so he thinks. He received a letter from a lawyer about his long-lost kooky uncle J. Giggles Flintstone. Uncle Giggles, who apparently lived out his days as a recluse in a spooky old mansion on Nightmare Hill, has finally kicked the bucket. And Fred, of course, is convinced he's about to inherit a big pile of cash.
Uncle J. Giggles Flintstone has passed away, naming you sole heir to his estate.
So on a night that's straight out of a Halloween special, complete with thunder, lightning, and a full moon, Fred, Wilma, Barney, and Betty roll up to Uncle Giggles' mansion for the reading of the will. The whole place screams haunted, but Fred's got dollar signs in his eyes and nothing's going to stop him from claiming that sweet inheritance. But there's always a catch. The lawyer tells Fred that in order to claim his fortune, he has to spend one night in Uncle Giggles' creepy mansion. If he doesn't, or if he kicks the bucket himself in the process, the inheritance will go to Giggles' trio of unsettling servants. Creepers the butler, who's never seen without a big knife, Potrock the cook, a tiny guy who carries a cleaver the size of a pterodactyl, and Wormstone the gardener, whose hedge clippers are strong enough to cut through stone. Seeing all this, Wilma and Betty make a beeline out of there, but Barney ends up locked in with Fred and they have to survive the night.
I forgot something. What did you forget? I forgot to stay home.
From the second Fred and Barney settle in for their night of terror, strange things start happening. First, there's this bone-chilling laugh echoing through the mansion, setting the mood for some major goosebumps. Then the eyes on Uncle Giggles' portrait start moving. After that, the pair try to sit down for dinner, but when Potrock serves up some alphabet soup, it spells out beware. Fred and Barney don't need another hint. They're convinced that it's been poisoned. If that's not enough, a suit of armor randomly comes to life and tries to clobber Fred. When he gets away from that, a mysterious hand shoots an arrow right into Fred's butt, and the creepy laughter continues. If that was me, I'd have already had 17 heart attacks. And the fun doesn't stop there. When Barney jokes about wanting twin beds, Potrock slices their bed clean in half with his giant cleaver. Fred and Barney, understandably freaked out,
Got twin beds, so make the best of it. No!
flee down the stairs, only to be attacked by Wormstone's clippers at the bottom. From then on, it's a full-blown panic fest. Fred ends up hiding in a stuffed animal wall ornament, and Barney crams himself into a large cuckoo clock. Somehow, they manage to survive the night through sheer dumb luck. Just when Fred is ready to celebrate becoming the proud owner of Uncle Giggles' estate, the real surprise hits. Giggles himself steps out of his portrait, very much alive and still cackling. Turns out the whole night was a test. Giggles wanted to see if Fred had a sense of humor, which was apparently a must for inheriting his fortune.
I wanted to see if he had a sense of humor like mine.
Spoiler, Fred's sense of humor left the building hours ago. He's had enough. So he grabs Potrock's cleaver and chases Uncle Giggles and the three spooky servants right out of the mansion. That's what you get when attempted murder is your idea of a joke. Dr. Sinister kicks off with Fred and Barney going to get some Brontosaurus burgers and buns and complaining about how normal their lives are. They want to do exciting stuff like spies do. Be careful what you wish for, because that's exactly what happens to them. They're stopped in the middle of the road by some frantic guy. This dude shoves an envelope into their hands, thinking they're couriers for some top secret spy stuff. He tells them to deliver it to 1717 Stony Lane before being whisked away by a car.
Here, take this and deliver it quick, or everything is lost.
Fred and Barney, always down to help, decide to play along and deliver the envelope. On the way there, they're bombarded with rocks by a bird and narrowly escape with their lives. They realize what's happening. Somebody's trying to kill them. They make their way to the mysterious address where Barney slips the envelope under the door. Next thing he knows, he's yanked inside by a pair of femme fatale arms. Fred, like a good friend, rushes in after him, and both of them are instantly charmed by the smoky-voiced, cigarette-puffing woman who introduces herself as Madame Yes. There's a French accent for reasons I'm not really aware of.
Hello, good lookings. I am Madame Yes.
There's a knock on the door, and before Fred and Barney can wrap their heads around what's happening, Madame Yes slips away through a secret passage, leaving them to deal with her very serious-looking enemies. Turns out they've gotten themselves tangled up in some kind of high-stakes espionage, and the bad guys want to know what happened to the plans in the envelope. Unfortunately for these wannabe Bond villains, Fred and Barney have no idea what's going on. They barely know what day it is. While Wilma and Betty wonder where their husbands are, Fred and Barney are snatched up and flown on a pterodactyl airplane. Wow. To a secret lair inside of a volcano. Because where else would a supervillain live? Madame Yes shows up and tells them to keep their secrets, which they don't know anything about. Enter Dr. Sinister, the green-skinned, red-haired, pointy-headed evil scientist behind all of this mess. Sinister gives the classic villain pitch down. He offers Fred and Barney a life of luxury and riches in exchange for some spy secrets. But the two have no information to share. Sinister's not buying it and decides to up the ante.
You still refuse to talk, eh? Take care of that.
Uh-oh, Barney, here we go again.
By tying them to a cot underneath a swinging pendulum blade. You know, classic villain shtick. Lucky for Fred and Barney, they're not as helpless as they seem. Barney, using a technique that he saw in a James Bond rock movie, lifts his arms just high enough for the pendulum to cut the ropes binding him. Once free, the two make a run for it, but their escape plan hits a snag when they find Madame Yes chained to a wall. Turns out she got caught too. Barney nabs the key from a snoozing guard and frees her. But before they can celebrate, Madame Yes accidentally drops a shackle, which wakes the guard. She manages to slip away. But Fred and Barney, they get caught, and the guard hauls them back to Dr. Sinister. Sinister, thinking that Fred and Barney are tougher than they look, tries to get them on board with his world domination scheme.
How would you like to become my partners?
Yeah, partners?
Yes.
Naturally, the two refuse, so Sinister threatens to drop them into a bottomless pit. Things are looking grim. But Fred and Barney, fueled by all those James Bond rock movies that they've watched, break out some surprisingly effective judo chops and manage to knock out Sinister's henchmen. Once they've cleared the room, Madame Yes reappears and leads them to the lair's self-destruct lever. She pulls the lever and the place starts going up in flames. Fred and Barney dive into the ocean and swim like their lives depend on it, while Madame Yes makes her escape by grabbing onto the feet of a passing pterodactyl.
She did it again, Barney. She did it again. Well, what do we do now, Fred?
Back at home, the wives don't believe a word of their insane story about spies, evil scientists, and volcano lairs. That is, until Madame Yes shows up at the Flintstones' door asking for help with her car trouble. Fred and Barney, sick of her leaving them behind everywhere, slams the door shut and start barricading it. Because after a day like that, they're done with spy life for good. Christmas Flintstone is all about, well, you guessed it, Christmas time in Bedrock. And Fred Flintstone's kinda broke. He's out walking with Barney downtown, checking out all the holiday decorations, when Fred tells Barney he needs some extra cash for Christmas presents. And he's ready to do whatever it takes to make sure everybody gets something under the tree. Luckily, he spots a sign at Macy Croc's department store looking for part-time help. Perfect. Fred rushes in to apply, and even though he doesn't even know what the job is yet, he's pumped. Wilma, on the other hand, isn't thrilled about him juggling two jobs, but Fred tells her it's just for a week. Fast forward to the next day, after clocking out at the quarry, Fred heads over to Macy Rocks and finds himself in the gift wrapping department. As you can imagine, gift wrapping is not exactly Fred's strong suit.
How's that?
Is this some kind of a joke?
But he does his best. Then he gets bored and starts wandering around the toy department, messing with all the cool stuff. Enter Mr. Macy Rock, the store's boss, who's not impressed with Fred's goofing off. He tells Fred to get his act together and moves stock to the basement. But in true Flintstone fashion, Fred tries using a broken freight elevator, and before you know it, he's fired.
Flintstone, you're fired!
Just when Fred thinks his Christmas gig is over, Macy Rock's assistant comes rushing in with a Christmas crisis. The guy they hired to play Santa Claus is sick, and they can't find anyone to replace him. Mr. Macy Rock looks at Fred, sees his Santa potential, and boom. Fred's got a new gig as Santa Claus. And boy does he deliver. Fred absolutely nails it. The kids love him, and he's having the time of his life. The next day, Fred even gets on TV as Bedrock's newest Santa.
And here he is, jolly old Saint Nick himself.
But right after the store closes, Fred is chilling in his Santa suit when two little elves, Blinky and Twinkie, show up out of nowhere. Fred's like, "Nice costume, kids." But before he knows it, he's being whisked away in a flying sleigh. Yep, a real magical flying sleigh. Next stop, the North Pole. Turns out the real Santa Claus has come down with a cold and needs someone to fill in for him. And who better than Bedrock's newest Santa? So with Blinky and Twinkie as his sleigh navigators, Fred is off, zooming around the world delivering presents to every kid's house. After his whirlwind night of sleigh flying and present delivering, Blinky and Twinkie drop Fred off near his house. But just when Fred's about to bask in the glory of his heroic night, he realizes he left his family's presents in the sleigh. Oh no.
Hey, wait a minute. I left my own presents in the sled. Hey, Blinky, wait!
Fred heads home, thinking that he's going to explain how he lost their presents. But when he walks through the door, Wilma, Barney, and Betty are there, already holding the presents that he bought for them. They're all smiles, saying that Fred in his Santa suit had just dropped them off, and they're glad he's feeling better after that cold. Confused, Fred looks outside and spots the real Santa Claus flying through the skies, still sneezing. Turns out the big guy himself finished Fred's delivery for him, because there's nothing that says Christmas spirit like looking out for other people. The Time Machine opens with Fred, Wilma, Betty, and Barney deciding to visit the World's Fair. They're having a great time on the roller coaster and a bunch of other games when they're roped in by a wacky scientist to test his latest invention, a time machine. Skeptical, but curious, they hop in and are instantly flung into ancient Rome.
How they're dressed, all wrapped up in bed sheets.
In Rome, Fred and Barney find themselves in the Colosseum, nearly becoming Linosaurus snacks while Emperor Nero watches fiddle in hand. After a narrow escape, they end up on Christopher Columbus's ship. He makes them scrub the deck while his crew tries to overthrow him. Turns out it was Wilma, not Columbus, who found America.
Look, boys, the land! It's America!
After that, they land in medieval times, where Fred ends up jousting as Sir Lancelot's stand-in and somehow wins. The king offers him his daughter's hand in marriage, but Fred is quick to decline. Even a princess has nothing on Wilma Flintstone. Unfortunately, the king decides to have him executed for this, and they get saved by the time machine just in the nick of time. Before they know it, they're in Philadelphia, getting zapped by Benjamin Franklin's kite experiment. Fast forward to the futuristic Jet Age, where they're chased into a Stone Age exhibit at a Space Age World's Fair. Finally, the chaotic journey ends as the four return to the present. Fred, thoroughly fed up, chews out the scientist for his crazy invention, declaring him nutty.
And if that's how your time machine works, you can have it, buddy.
Shaken but happy to be back, the gang leaves the fair, grateful to be in one time period, home sweet home. The episode Samantha opens up with, well, Samantha, whose husband Darren is away on business, deciding to shake things up a little bit. With her husband out of town, she's left her own devices, and soon finds herself befriending two other ladies who could use a little excitement, Wilma Flintstone and Betty Rubble. Fred and Barney are off on a camping trip, leaving Wilma and Betty to hold down the fort at home with the kiddos, Pebbles and Bam Bam. But Samantha has a better idea. Why not crash the boys' camping trip and have a little outdoor adventure of their own?
What do you say?
I say, Yabba Dabba Doo!
Oh, and the dialogue here insinuates that this Samantha is an honest-to-God witch, and she proves it with some witchcraft too, moving around shelves and cleaning beds, getting everything done except combing Bam Bam's hair. Not even magic can do that. Now, Wilma and Betty love the idea, but are quick to admit that they have zero experience camping on their own. That doesn't faze Samantha one bit. She's got a little magical backup plan, of course. So with a nose twitch here and a little hocus-pocus there, she makes sure the ladies are all set to outshine their husbands in the wilderness, and sets up her place too, just for funsies. When she realizes they'll need a car, she just turns a skateboard into one. Wow, this is gonna be fun.
Well, that'll have to do. Not bad.
While Fred and Barney are talking about how great the privacy they have is, Wilma and Betty are setting up camp nearby, with Pebbles and Bam Bam with them. Wilma and Betty laid down the challenge to stay as long as they stay, but Fred and Barney laugh them off. When they go fishing later, Samantha asks Fred and Barney what kind of bait they're using, and in typical Fred-Barney fashion, they can't resist messing with her. They say they're using rocks.
You catch with a rock. The bigger the rock, the bigger the fish.
Thinking they pulled a fast one on Samantha, but Samantha is no fool. She goes right ahead and uses rocks as bait, tying them to the fishing poles for her, Pebbles, and Bam Bam. A little nose twitch and some magic later, and voila! They caught 6 fish, while Fred and Barney can't even get a nibble. The guys are left scratching their heads. If they only knew. Later, Fred and Barney figure if they can't catch any fish, they'll just swipe some of Wilma and Betty's food instead. But Samantha's not about to let that happen. She uses her magic to get their food back. When Fred and Barney try to scare them away using scary voices, she conjures up a giant dinosaur and a pterodactyl to scare the pants off the guys.
You sure there aren't any wild animals around here, Fred?
Of course there are.
If that's not enough, she makes it rain and transforms a tiny harmless kitten into a roaring Tigerosaurus, sending Fred and Barney running for their lives. Of course, when Wilma and Betty look over, all they see is the kitten lounging around like nothing's happened. Meanwhile, Fred and Barney are shaking in their boots, totally humiliated by how badly they've been shown up in the wilderness. It doesn't take long before the boys finally admit defeat, humbled by their wives' newfound camping experience. They say that maybe, just maybe, Wilma and Betty are better at camping than they are. Samantha is happy to see the guys finally giving credit where credit is due. And as for Darren, well, what he doesn't know won't hurt him. Samantha's not about to tell him about her magical camping trip. I don't know about you guys, but I'd say that's a pretty magical start to a friendship. The Great Gazo starts when a tiny green alien named Gazo crash lands in front of Fred's car. Gazo, exiled from his planet Zetox for being too arrogant, is stuck on Stone Age Earth until he can redeem himself by helping its primitive inhabitants. Those inhabitants being Fred and Barney. With a flick of his fingers, Gazo conjures up everything the two could ever want, from food to riches. But there's a catch. No adult, except Fred and Barney, can see him.
Explain all this to him, will you, Gazo?
I can't. You two are the only ones who can see me.
When a policeman shows up to check on the chaos caused by Gazo's magic, the alien makes everything vanish, leaving the officer confused, and Fred and Barney's wives convince the guys are making it all up. Gazo turns them into chickens to prove it, but it seems to have no effect. Gazo then gives them dresses for their wives, which they both love. Testing their luck, Fred and Barney try to use Gazo's power to impress Wilma and Betty with a fancy dinner at La Chateau Rockenbleu. But Gazo doesn't show up when it's time to pay the $225 bill, leaving Fred and Barney sweating bullets and washing dishes. Wilma and Betty thankfully cover the tab with their vacation savings, and Gazo promises to be a bit more dependable in the future, but reminds them to ask for only as much as they can handle.
Since I am supposed to serve you, I will try. But take heed. Don't ask for more than you can handle.
He makes it up to Fred by making flowers appear in his hand, which Fred gives to Wilma. And then Gazo turns the lights out on them and the episode. R.I.P. Van Flintstone opens with Fred bored, restless, and looking for something to do. So naturally, he tries his hand at riding a skatebone at the supermarket, which ends about as well as you'd expect. Pure chaos. After nearly demolishing the place, Fred's still feeling irritable, and winds up being a nuisance at the Slate Company picnic. He annoys his friends, drives his coworkers crazy, and eventually decides he's had enough of the socializing, and heads off to a quiet spot for a quick nap. Fred being Fred, that quick nap turns into something much stranger. When he wakes up, he's got a long white beard that trips him every time he tries to move. His first thought? Barney must have glued it on as a prank.
I bet Barney did this, because I didn't laugh at his corny joke.
But things get weird pretty quickly. He can't find Dino or anyone from the picnic, and the once bustling picnic area now looks like it's been abandoned for years. Confused, Fred wanders into Bedrock and tries to make sense of what's going on. When he asks someone about the Slate Company picnic, the guy looks at him like he's crazy. Turns out the Slate Company's been out of business for 20 years. Fred stumbles into the Bedrock pool hall, hoping to find his old buddies, but no one knows any of his friends. Things are looking pretty grim for Fred. He heads home, only to find some other family living in his house, and they waste no time chasing him off the property. Now really freaked out, Fred makes his way to Barney's place, hoping for some answers. When he knocks on the door, he's met by a stranger who tells him that Barney, now going by BJ Rubble, struck it rich almost 20 years ago and lives in a mansion called Sandstone Simeon. That's when it hits Fred like a ton of Bronto burgers. He's been asleep for 20 years.
Maybe he's right. Maybe I have been asleep for 20 years.
Fred, devastated that he slept his life away, heads over to see Barney at his fancy new mansion. Barney, now older and wealthier, doesn't believe it's really Fred at first. But when Dino, now a little gray around the edges, immediately recognizes him, the doubts vanish. Fred explains the whole slept for 20 years situation, and Barney fills him in on what's happened while he was snoozing. The biggest shocker? Pebbles and Bam Bam are married. They live at the mansion too. Fred is overjoyed to see his daughter all grown up and happily married. But it's bittersweet. He missed out on watching her grow. Barney, trying to spare Pebbles any unnecessary emotional roller coasters, introduces Fred as Mr. Glump, a friend from the past, so as not to overwhelm her.
Mr. Glump. Thanks, son. That's Bam Bam, all right?
Fred, moved by how happy his daughter is, tries to hold back his feelings of regret for having missed her whole childhood. Barney then gives Fred some good news. He and Betty have been taking care of Wilma, and she's living in a cottage on the estate. Eager to see his wife, Fred rushes over. But when he finds her, Wilma's vision and hearing have faded. At first, she mistakes Fred for some random brush salesman. After a few attempts to convince her it's really him, Fred pulls up his beard, and Wilma immediately recognizes that familiar tummy. It's her Fred.
By golly, look at that tummy. It is, Fred.
Wilma, understandably, is a mix of shock and anger. She spent the last 20 years raising Pebbles by herself, and Fred's explanation of "I fell asleep and didn't wake up for 2 decades" doesn't exactly go over well. She gives him an earful, demanding that he wake up. And just like that, Fred jolts awake for real. Turns out he's still at the Slate Company picnic and only an hour has passed. No white beard, no 20-year nap, just a wild dream. Relieved and feeling like a new man, Fred ditches the crankiness and decides to fully embrace the picnic. He jumps back into the festivities, full of enthusiasm, participating in all the events with a new sense of appreciation for his life, his family, and his friends. Fred realizes it's best not to sleep through life, literally or figuratively. Curtain call at Bedrock kicks off with the Bedrock PTA gearing up for a big fundraiser, and Wilma Flintstone has been appointed as the head honcho to organize the whole thing. What's on the agenda? A play, of course. And not just any play, but the PTA's performance of Romeo Rock and Juliet Stone, Bedrock's version of the classic love story. Wilma's already taken on the role of Juliet Stone, while Betty and Barney have been cast as the Capulet Slates, Juliet Stone's parents. I don't know, some of these sound kinda forced. Naturally, she offers Fred the lead role of Romeo Rock. Fred declines at first.
You will be Romeo Rock.
And I will be Romeo. Hold it, hold it!
So she asks Barney to do it, but he just kinda sucks. That's when Fred starts reciting the lines from outside the window, and Wilma just knows it has to be Fred. Fred learns all of his lines like a champ, but there's one tiny problem: the tights. Fred just can't bring himself to wear those tight-fitting Stone Age leggings on stage. The guy can barely handle a tie, let alone prancing around in tights. He stubbornly refuses to be Romeo Rock and insists on being the understudy instead, leaving Wilma no choice but to cast Barney as the star-crossed lover. Barney's not exactly thrilled about playing the romantic lead. Enter Gazo, who decides to work his alien magic by zapping Barney with all the knowledge of the play's dialogue. Boom. Now Barney's got the lines down pat. But there's still one small hiccup. Barney's acting is, well, let's just say Romeo Rock would have been better off with anybody else. Even with all the lines memorized, Barney's delivery is so bad that even he knows Fred could do a better job. As curtain time approaches, Barney decides he's just too bad to do the part, and devises a brilliant plan to get out of this mess. Just 15 minutes before the show starts, Barney claims to have come down with a case of the mumps.
Mumps? You have the mumps? Oh, no, you can't have.
Fred, ever the sucker for a guilt trip, reluctantly steps into the role of Romeo Rock at the last minute. But fate's not done messing with this production just yet. Right before the show starts, Wilma suddenly loses her voice, struck with a bout of laryngitis. Now they need a new Juliet Stone. And guess who's the only person left standing around with nothing to do? You guessed it, Barney. After all, he's already recovered from his fake mumps. So Barney, in a blonde wig and with a face full of makeup, is about to become the most unlikely Juliet Stone in the history of Bedrock theater. The play begins, and from the first moment Fred and Barney take the stage, it's a disaster waiting to happen. Both of them are fumbling their lines, clearly embarrassed, and trying to avoid eye contact. Then, as Fred stands on a ladder during the iconic balcony scene, disaster strikes. The ladder wobbles, and Fred takes a tumble. Barney and Betty rush to catch him, but instead they send the entire balcony set crashing to the ground. At this point, the audience is howling with laughter, but not for the reasons that you'd expect. Gazo, sitting in the crowd, is loving every second of the chaos as the performance turns into a full-blown comedy of errors. Get it? Another Shakespeare play. Anyway, but surprisingly, the reviews the next day are glowing.
Romeo Rock and Juliet Stone turns out to be a smash comedy.
Turns out the audience thought the entire thing was an intentional spoof of the classic play. They believed the slapstick mishaps and awkward performances were all part of the show, making it one of the most entertaining nights Bedrock had seen in a long time. And that was our recap of the Flintstones. Man, going through those episodes, you can just see how many comedy tropes these guys invented. It was an absolute pleasure going through the vault for these, and I, for one, had a really good time. Thank you for joining us today, and let me know which one of these episodes was your favorite. As always, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. See ya!